My name is Hannah, and I was 33 the day I found out my mother-in-law had secretly swabbed my sleeping daughter's cheek and mailed it to a lab to prove my little girl wasn't really ours. Sophie was 5. She had copper red hair and a gap in her front teeth, and she still slept with a stuffed rabbit named Beans. And while she napped on her grandmother's couch one Sunday afternoon, Vivian Whitfield knelt down with a cotton swab and took a piece of her. Without asking me, without asking anyone, and she sent it 3 states away in a prepaid envelope. Vivian wanted proof that I had cheated, that Sophie wasn't a Whitfield, that I was a liar who'd slipped a stranger's child into her perfect family tree. The results came back, and they ended a story all right, just not the one she thought. Welcome to Composed Drama Stories, where the women everyone underestimated finally tell their side. If quiet strength and slow justice are your kind of evening, stay with me. Here's the part Vivian never planned for. About 3 weeks after those results posted, a message arrived from a man none of us had ever heard of. A man in Pennsylvania. He said the lab had matched him to my daughter as close family. And he had one simple question. He wanted to know who his mother was. But to understand why that question made a 67-year-old woman go white at her own dinner table, you need to know who Vivian Whitfield was, and who she'd spent her whole life pretending to be. Let me take you back to the beginning. I met Daniel Whitfield when I was 23, behind the counter of a coffee shop where I worked 2 jobs to cover my rent. I grew up in a small house with a leaky roof. My dad was a mechanic with grease that never fully washed out of his hands, and he was the kindest man I ever knew. We didn't have money. We had each other, and we had enough, and I never once felt poor until I met the Whitfields. Daniel was different from the start. He didn't talk about money even though his family had a lot of it. He was gentle and a little shy, and he laughed at my jokes like they were the funniest things he'd ever heard. We dated for 2 years. We married when I was 25. In a small ceremony I mostly paid for myself, because by then it was very clear that his mother did not approve of me. Vivian Whitfield was the kind of woman who could insult you so politely, you'd thank her for it. She ran the garden club. She sat on the hospital board. Her late husband Harold had built Whitfield properties from one strip mall into a commercial real estate company worth millions. And when Harold died, Vivian became the keeper of all of it, the money, the name, and what she called the family standard. The first time Daniel brought me to Sunday dinner, Vivian looked me up and down, smiled that smile, and said, "And what does your family do, dear?" When I told her my father fixed cars, she said, "How useful." Then she never asked me another question about myself again. Not for 8 years. I want to be honest with you about something, because it matters for everything that comes later. For 8 years, I tried to win that woman over. I really did. I brought the right wine, I learned which fork, I complimented her hydrangeas, I bit my tongue 1,000 times. I told myself if I were just good enough, patient enough, gracious enough, she'd eventually let me in. That was my mistake, but I didn't understand that yet. Then, Sophie was born, and everything got worse. Because Sophie came out with a full head of bright red hair. Now, nobody in the Whitfield family had red hair. They were all dark Harold, Vivian, Daniel, all of them. And from the day my daughter was born, Vivian had a new project. A quiet one. A cruel one. She'd hold Sophie at a christening or a birthday, tilt her head, and say to whoever was nearby, "Well, she certainly didn't get that hair from us." Light, pleasant, like a joke. But it wasn't a joke. It was a seed. And she planted it everywhere she could. I'd catch the looks, the little pauses, an aunt asking, a bit too casually, whether anyone in my family was a redhead, and I'd say, yes, actually, my grandmother and an uncle, which was true. But it never stopped the whispers, because the whispers were never really about hair. They were about whether I belonged, whether my child belonged, whether the working-class girl from the house with the leaky roof had pulled something over on the great Whitfield name. I'll give you one moment so you understand what it was like. Sophie's 3rd birthday. We threw it in Vivian's big backyard because Vivian insisted, and then she spent the whole afternoon acting like a guest at a party she was hosting. There was a moment near the cake when one of Daniel's cousins, a kind woman named Beth, said how gorgeous Sophie's hair was, and Vivian, holding her wine, smiled at the little circle of women around her and said, "It is striking, isn't it? You know, I keep a photo of Harold's side going back 4 generations. Not a redhead in the bunch. A pause. A sip. Genetics are just full of surprises." And she let it sit there, in front of 8 people, with my 3-year-old smearing frosting on her own face 6 feet away. Nobody said anything. That's the part that still gets me. Nobody defended me, because to defend me out loud would have meant admitting what Vivian was really saying. So everyone just looked at their plates, and the silence agreed with her. I stood there, holding a stack of paper napkins, and I smiled. Because what else do you do? And inside, I felt like the floor had a trapdoor in it, and only I could see it. That was the whole pattern of those years. She never once said the cruel thing directly. She built it out of pauses and photographs and that wine glass smile, so that if I ever objected, I'd be the crazy one, the oversensitive one, the girl who couldn't take a joke. She made the cruelty impossible to catch and impossible to forget. And Daniel, I love him. I do. But I have to tell you the truth about him in those years. Daniel didn't fight her. He'd say, "That's just how Mom is." He'd change the subject. He'd squeeze my hand under the table and look at me with apology in his eyes. And then he'd say nothing. He had spent 36 years learning that you do not cross Vivian Whitfield, and that lesson was deep in his bones. So I stood mostly alone in that family, for years, and I told myself I could carry it. What I didn't know was that Vivian had already decided she was going to do more than whisper. Let me tell you about the trust, because this is where the whispers grew teeth. When Harold died, he left behind something called the Whitfield Family Trust. In plain words, a trust is just a big pot of money with rules attached, controlled by one person on behalf of everyone else. Harold's trust held a little over $4 million. It was meant to pay for the grandchildren's education and to give each of them a share when they turned 25. And the person who controlled it, the trustee, was Vivian. That gave her power. Real power. Not just opinions at the dinner table. She decided who got what. And about 6 months before the swab, Vivian started saying a new thing. She started saying it to Daniel, and to the family lawyer, and to anyone who'd listen. She said that before any trust money went to Sophie. The family had a responsibility to be certain of lineage. Lineage, that's just a fancy word for bloodline. Who you're really descended from. She never said the word cheating out loud. She was too smart for that. She'd just say, "We owe it to Harold's legacy to be sure," and let everyone fill in the blank. She dressed her cruelty up as duty. That was her gift. I found out about all of it on a Tuesday, when the family lawyer called me, not Daniel, me to gently ask whether I'd be open to a conversation about confirming Sophie's eligibility. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and my 5-year-old coloring at the table behind me, and I felt the floor tilt. They wanted to put my daughter on trial for the crime of having red hair. I want to tell you exactly how that phone call went, because I replayed it for weeks. The lawyer's name was Mr. Prescott, a soft-spoken man Harold had used for 30 years. He started with small talk about the weather, which is how you know something rotten is coming. Then he said, "Hannah, Vivian has asked me to explore a process for confirming each grandchild's eligibility under the trust. It's nothing personal, just due diligence. Due diligence. Like my daughter was a piece of property he was checking the title on. I asked him, "Are you doing this for all the grandchildren? Or just Sophie?" And there was this long, awful pause. And in that pause, I had my answer. It was just Sophie. There were 4 other grandchildren in that family, and not one of them was being asked to prove they were real. Just mine. Just the one with the red hair and the mother from the house with the leaky roof. I held it together on the phone. I said no, clearly and calmly, and I hung up, and then I stood in my kitchen and shook. Sophie looked up from her coloring and said, "Mama, are you cold?" And I said, "A little, baby." Because how do you explain to a 5-year-old that grown-ups with money are quietly deciding whether she gets to count? I made us hot chocolate instead. I watched her draw a picture of our family 3 stick figures and a stick figure rabbit, and I thought, you have no idea that there's a war going on over your head. And I'm going to make very sure you never find out. That promise was about the only power I had left. I said no. Of course I said no. I said it was insulting and it wasn't happening, and Daniel agreed with me, for once, and we thought that was the end of it. It wasn't the end of it. Because Vivian Whitfield did not take no for an answer. She just stopped asking. Here's what I pieced together later about that Sunday. It was an ordinary visit. Sophie loved her grandmother's house, the big yard, the koi pond, the candy dish Vivian kept stocked. Sophie didn't understand any of the grown-up coldness. To her, Grandma Vivian was the lady with the candy and the fish. So when Vivian suggested Sophie come spend a Sunday afternoon while Daniel and I ran errands, we said yes. God help me, we said yes. And while my daughter napped on the couch under a crocheted blanket, Vivian opened a kit she'd ordered from a company called Heritage Line. A DINA company, the kind where you mail in a sample and they tell you your ancestry and connect you to relatives. She knelt down beside my sleeping child, ran a swab along the inside of her cheek, sealed it in a tube, and dropped it in the mail. She did it under her own name, her own account, her own email. Remember that. It matters more than she could possibly have known. When I finally learned what she'd done, weeks later, I felt something I'd never felt before. Not sadness, not even anger, at first. It was something colder. The understanding that this woman had reached into the one place I thought was safe my child's body while she slept and taken something to use against us. But let me not get ahead of myself, because for a while, after she mailed it, nothing happened. And those weeks of nothing are where I want to sit, because that's where I learned what helplessness really feels like. I didn't know about the swab yet. What I knew was that the pressure was building, and I had no way to push back. The lawyer kept calling. Vivian kept dropping her little poisoned comments. And I started to feel like I was disappearing inside my own family. I'd lie awake at night and run the same loop. If I fought too hard, I looked guilty. If I didn't fight, they'd cut Sophie out. If I told Daniel to choose between me and his mother, I might lose him, because I genuinely didn't know which way he'd go. There was no move that didn't cost me something. That's the trap Vivian built. Every door led to a wall. I remember one night I sat on the edge of Sophie's bed after she fell asleep, just watching her breathe. That red hair spread across the pillow, the little gap in her teeth. And I thought, you are the most loved child in the world, and there are people with money and lawyers who are working very hard to decide you don't count. And I couldn't protect her from it. I could lock the doors, I could screen the calls, but I couldn't stop a powerful old woman from deciding my daughter was a stain to be cleaned up. That's the helplessness. It isn't loud. It's the quiet of lying in the dark doing math that never comes out in your favor. I tried to talk to Daniel about it, more than once, in those weeks. I'd wait until Sophie was asleep and I'd sit him down and say, plainly, your mother is trying to take our daughter's place in this family. I need you to stand between her and us. And Daniel, he'd get this pained, trapped look, and he'd say things like, she's getting older. Han, she doesn't mean it the way it sounds. If we just don't react, she'll lose interest. And every time he said it, something in me sank a little lower. Because I wasn't asking him to win a war. I was asking him to admit there was one, and he couldn't, because admitting it would mean choosing. And he'd been raised to never, ever choose against his mother. I want you to understand, I didn't hate him for it. I understood it. Vivian had spent 36 years training that boy to fold. But understanding why someone can't protect you doesn't make you feel any more protected. I'd lie next to him at night, both of us awake, both of us pretending to sleep, a foot of cold sheet between us. And I had never felt more alone inside a marriage. The contrast was the thing that hurt most. Because I knew what family was supposed to feel like. I grew up in it. My dad's house was small, and the heat barely worked, and we ate a lot of spaghetti. But when I walked in that door, I was the most welcome person in the world. Nobody ever made me audition. Nobody ever checked my bloodline against a photo album. My dad used to say, we don't have much. Hannah Bug. But everybody who walks through that door leaves fuller than they came. And here I was, married into more money than my father would see in 10 lifetimes, sitting at a table set with Crystal. And I had never been hungrier in my life. Hungry to just be let in. There was a friend I lost in those weeks, too. Beth, the cousin who'd complimented Sophie's hair. I'd thought of her as an ally. But when things got tense and the trust lawyer started calling, Beth stopped returning my texts. She'd picked a side, and it wasn't mine. Because Vivian held the keys to everything, and everybody knew it. That's what real power does in a family. It doesn't have to threaten you. People just quietly arrange themselves around it. And I watched, week by week, as the people I thought might stand with me found reasons to be somewhere else. I almost broke during those weeks. I won't pretend I didn't. There was a night I called my dad, just to hear his voice, and I didn't even tell him what was happening because I didn't want to put it on him. He could tell something was wrong. He said, Hannah Bug, you've never once needed anybody's permission to be exactly who you are. Don't go starting now. I cried in the car for 20 minutes after we hung up. I didn't know yet how right he was, and then the results posted. And everything Vivian built started to come apart in her own hands. Let me tell you what those results said, because the irony of it still takes my breath away. First, Sophie was Daniel's daughter. Without question. The test confirmed she was a true Whitfield grandchild, Vivian's own blood. Every cruel whisper, every raised eyebrow, every she certainly didn't get that hair from us, gone in a single line of data. The thing Vivian spent 5 years insinuating was simply provably false. Sophie belonged. She always had. Now, if that were all, Vivian would have buried the results and moved on to her next weapon. She'd have told no one. A test that proves you wrong is a test you make disappear. But that's not all the test found, because that's not how these DNA companies work. When you send in a sample, they don't just tell you your ancestry. They compare your DNA against everyone else in their database, and they show you your relatives. Anyone you share enough DNA with, they connect you. A cousin you never knew, a half-sibling. And the more DNA you share, the closer the relative. When Sophie's profile went live, the system found a match, a strong one. A man in the database shared so much DNA with my daughter that the company flagged him as close family, the range they use for a half-uncle. A half-uncle, in plain words, would be a half-brother to her father, which would mean a son. A son that Vivian or Harold had somewhere out in the world that nobody knew about. And the man it matched? He'd been in that database for 2 years. Waiting, searching, hoping someone exactly like this would finally show up. His name was Michael Doyle. He was 48 years old. And the day Sophie's results posted, his phone lit up with a notification that said a close relative had just joined. I need to tell you about Michael because for most of this story, he's the quiet center of it. And he never asked to be. Michael was born in September of 1977. He was adopted as a newborn through a Catholic agency and raised by a good, plain couple in Scranton, Pennsylvania. His adoptive parents loved him, and they never hid that he was adopted. He grew up, became a carpenter, married a nurse named Donna, raised 2 kids, an ordinary, decent life. When his adoptive parents passed, a few years back, Michael did what a lot of adopted people do. He took a DNA test. Not to replace the family who raised him, he was clear about that, but because he had no medical history. He didn't know if heart disease ran in his blood, or cancer, or anything. And somewhere under that, quietly, he wanted to know one thing. He wanted to know why he'd been given up. He wanted to know if his mother ever thought about him. For 2 years, his test turned up nothing but distant cousins. Then a 5-year-old girl with red hair, 3 states away, joined a database and the whole thing cracked open. Michael, being a careful and gentle man, didn't barge in. He sent one message through the company's system to the account that managed Sophie's profile. He wrote that he didn't want to cause trouble, that he understood this might be a shock, that he was just a man trying to understand where he came from. And he asked, as kindly as a person can ask such a thing, whether anyone could help him find his birth mother. That message went to the account that owned Sophie's sample. It went to Vivian. And Vivian knew. The instant she read it, she knew exactly who Michael Doyle was. She'd known for 48 years. Now here's where the whole thing finally reached me. And it reached me because Vivian, for the first time in her life, panicked. A woman who is always composed becomes very dangerous and very clumsy when she's afraid. And Vivian was terrified. Her perfect sealed secret had just sent her a message through a machine. And she didn't know how to make it go away. She couldn't unring the bell. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She tried to control the story by getting ahead of it. She called an emergency family dinner. She said it was about the trust. And at that dinner, in front of Daniel and me and a couple of relatives, she launched a preemptive strike. She started talking, all wound up, about how she'd had concerns confirmed, about how certain things had come to light about this family that I had brought into it, pointing the cloud of suspicion back at me, hard, before anyone could point it anywhere else. And in the middle of her own performance, she slipped. She said, "I did what a responsible grandmother had to do. I had the child tested." The table went silent. Daniel said, very quietly, "You did what?" And I watched Vivian realize, a half-second too late, that she'd just confessed to swabbing my sleeping daughter, without permission, in a room full of witnesses, while trying to make herself the hero of the story. She tried to backpedal. She couldn't. The words were already out, and they were already true, and everyone had heard them. What none of us at that table knew, yet what I wouldn't understand for another 2 weeks, was that the test Vivian was bragging about had already betrayed her. She thought she'd been caught doing something sneaky, but defensible. A worried grandmother, overstepping, she had no idea that the same little tube she'd mailed off in secret had quietly handed a 48-year-old secret to a man in Pennsylvania, and that he was, at that very moment, sitting at his own kitchen table 3 states away, staring at a notification, working up the courage to write back. Vivian thought the dinner was her worst night. It wasn't even close. That was the moment the ground shifted. Not because I'd planned anything. I hadn't. Vivian handed me the first thread herself, because she could not stop performing long enough to think. And once I had that thread, I was going to pull it all the way to the end. I want to walk you through what I did next, slowly, because this is the part where I stopped being the woman things happened to. That night, after the disaster of a dinner, Daniel and I sat in our car in Vivian's driveway and didn't drive away for a long time. He was shaking. He kept saying, "She tested Sophie," while she was asleep. She actually did that. 8 years of that's just how Mom has died in that driveway. I watched my husband finally see his mother clearly, and as awful as the night was, something between us got stronger right there. He took my hand and he said, "I'm done covering for her. Whatever this is, we find out together." For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't standing alone. The next morning, I started making calls, not loud ones, careful ones. First, I needed the actual results, the full report, the matches, everything Vivian had seen. She controlled the account, and she was never going to share it. But Michael Doyle had reached out through that same system, which meant Michael could see his side of the match. So I did the simplest, most direct thing. I found him. It took 2 days. His message had named the Dina company and his own name. From there, it wasn't hard, a man named Michael Doyle, a carpenter near Scranton. I called him. My hands were sweating. And when he picked up, I said, "Miss Doyle, my name is Hannah Whitfield. I think the little girl who matched you is my daughter, and I think we need to talk." There was a long pause. Then this big, careful voice said, "Thank you for calling me back. You have no idea how long I've been hoping somebody would." We talked for 2 hours that first time. And piece by piece, the real story came together, the one Vivian had buried under 48 years of garden clubs and hospital boards and the family standard. We didn't get it all in one call. It took weeks of them. Michael would call after he got off a job site, sawdust still on his voice, and we'd compare notes like 2 people slowly assembling a puzzle neither of us had the box for. He was so careful with me. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Here was a man who'd been given away as a newborn and spent 2 years searching. And the closest he'd ever gotten was a 5-year-old's Dina profile and a stranger named Hannah, and instead of pushing, he kept apologizing for taking up my time. He'd say, "If this is too much, you tell me, and I'll disappear." I don't want to wreck anybody's life. I told him he wasn't wrecking anything. I told him the wreck had happened long before he showed up. He was just the daylight finally getting in. He told me about the photograph. The only thing that came with him when he was placed for adoption was a single faded picture his adoptive mother had saved for him in a shoebox, a young woman in a hospital gown, holding a newborn for what was clearly the only time, her face turned half away from the camera. He'd looked at that photo his whole life and wondered who she was. He scanned it and emailed it to me, and the first time I opened it on my phone, standing in my own kitchen, I had to sit down. Because even with her face half turned, even 48 years younger, I knew that jaw. I knew those cheekbones. I had been smiled at, coldly, by that exact face across a crystal set table 100 times. We checked everything we could check. His birthday, September 14th, 1977. The agency. A Catholic charity that handled placements across 2 states. The hospital, in a town not 40 miles from where Vivian grew up. None of it was proof a court would take, but every single piece fit the shape, and not one piece contradicted it. Michael started calling Vivian she in our talks. Never my mother. Like he didn't dare hope. And I started to feel the weight of what I was holding. This wasn't a weapon against Vivian anymore. This was a man's entire life. The question he'd carried since before he could remember. And it was sitting in my hands. Here's what we figured out, and how. Michael was born in September 1977. The match said his close blood relation came through Sophie's father's side through the Whitfields. But here was the thing that didn't fit at first. Harold and Vivian didn't marry until 1982. Daniel wasn't born until 1989. So if Michael was a half-brother to Daniel, born in 1977, then his parent, the one who gave him up, had him 5 years before Harold and Vivian were even married. That ruled out a simple Harold had an affair story. The math pointed somewhere else. The math pointed at Vivian herself, at 19 years old in 1977, years before she ever met Harold Whitfield. But I couldn't prove a feeling. I needed something solid. And this is where I hit a wall. Adoption records from 1977 in that state were sealed. Sealed means locked by the court. You can't just walk in and read them. Michael had been trying to unseal his for years, and getting nowhere. So the paper trail that would name his birth mother was behind a door neither of us could open. For about a week I thought we were stuck. The truth was right there, and I couldn't reach it. Then I remembered Daniel's Aunt Joan. But before Joan, I hit every wall there was, and I want you to see me hitting them. Because nobody handed me this. I started with the adoption agency. I called the Catholic charity that had placed Michael and asked, as politely as I could, how a family might confirm a birth-parent connection. The woman on the phone was kind, but firm. Records from 1977 were sealed by the court, she said. Sealed means a judge locked them, and only a judge can unlock them, and even then, usually only with the birth parent's consent. Michael had petitioned years ago and been denied. The one document on earth with Vivian's name on it as the mother was behind a door the law would not open for us. I tried the hospital next, 48-year-old maternity records, long since purged or sealed. Another wall. I spent one entire evening on genealogy sites and public archives, looking for any thread, a birth index, a name change, anything, and came up with nothing but dead ends and a headache. Around midnight, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, and I genuinely thought, this is it. This is where it stops. The truth was real, and I could feel it, and I still could not reach out and touch it. Vivian had buried it so deep, so long ago. in an era built to bury exactly this kind of secret that the official world had simply agreed to forget. But official records aren't the only kind of memory. People remember. People who were there remember. And the one thing Vivian could not seal was the recollection of a family that had watched a 19-year-old girl vanish for the better part of a year and come home changed. That's when I remembered Daniel's Aunt Joan. Joan was Harold's younger sister. She was in her 70s, sharp as a tack, and she'd never much liked Vivian. I drove out to see her, and I didn't lead with accusations. I just asked her, gently, about the old days, about when she first met Vivian. And Joan got a strange look on her face and said something I'll never forget. She said, when Harold started courting Vivian, there was always this thing nobody talked about. Vivian had been away. The whole year before, she'd gone to live with an aunt up in Vermont, came back in the spring of '78, thin and quiet. Different, her family said she'd been helping the aunt who was sick. But the aunt outlived her by 20 years. Joan looked at me. I always wondered. A girl doesn't disappear for a year over a sick aunt. It wasn't proof, but it was the shape of the truth, told by someone who'd watched it happen. A 19-year-old girl sent away in 1977, gone the better part of a year, returned hollow. And a baby boy, born that September, handed to strangers. I had the shape. Now I needed Vivian to fill it in. And I was not going to force it out of her in private, where she could lie and deny and twist it. I wanted it to happen where it couldn't be unsaid, where Daniel could see, and the family could see, and Michael, if he wanted, could finally be seen. But first, I had to make a choice. And it was the hardest part of this whole thing. I didn't make it alone. And that mattered. Daniel and I stayed up most of one night talking it through at our own kitchen table, the good kind of talking we hadn't done in years. He was wrestling with something huge. This was his mother. Whatever she'd done, he'd loved her his whole life. And a part of him was grieving the woman he thought he'd had. But he also kept looking at the photo of Michael as a baby, and at the photo of that 19-year-old girl. And I watched him do the math the same way I had. He finally said, she did this to one of her own kids. She gave a baby away and then spent 48 years acting like the rest of us had to prove we were good enough for her. His voice cracked. Michael never got a choice. The least we can do is give him one now. Because by now I had everything I needed to destroy Vivian Whitfield. I could have walked into the next family gathering and burned her to the ground. After 8 years of her smiling cruelty, after the swab, after the trust, after watching her try to erase my daughter, believe me, part of me wanted to. I talked to Michael about it. I asked him what he wanted. And this gentle man who'd been thrown away as a baby said something that reorganized my whole heart. He said, I didn't come looking for revenge, Hannah. I came looking for a mother. I'd settle for the truth and a place to stand. Then he said, but it's your family. I'll follow your lead. And I realized I didn't want to use the truth as a weapon. I wanted to use it as a door. There's a difference. A weapon ends things. A door lets someone walk through. Vivian had spent her whole life slamming doors on people she decided didn't belong me, my dad, and 48 years ago, her own son. I decided I would not become her. So I planned the reckoning very differently than she'd expect. It happened at the big family dinner Vivian threw every spring, the one she used to display the family at its finest. Crystal on the table. The good china. A dozen relatives. Vivian at the head, fully back in control, certain she'd weathered the storm. She'd convinced herself the dinner table slip would blow over. She had no idea what was coming. because for once, I hadn't been whispering. I'd asked Daniel to invite one extra guest, and I'd asked Michael to wait in the den until I came for him. Let me slow this down, because this is the moment everything had been building toward, and it did not happen the way you'd think. There was no shouting. I never raised my voice. Not once. When the plates were cleared, I stood up. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. And I said, before dessert, I'd like to clear something up, because it's been hanging over this family for months. Vivian had Sophie's DNA tested. She's admitted that. So let's talk about what the test actually found. Vivian's smile froze. She started to say something smooth and dismissive. I let her. Then I said, gently, the test confirmed Sophie is Daniel's daughter. 100%. So, every single thing you've implied about me for 5 years that's finished. We can all agree on that, can't we? There were nods around the table. A couple of relatives wouldn't meet Vivian's eye. She'd been caught in 5 years of smoke, and the smoke had just cleared, and everyone could see it. But I didn't stop there. I said, the test found something else, though. It found a relative, a close one. A man who shares so much DNA with Sophie that the lab calls him family. And I watched the color drain out of Vivian Whitfield's face, the same way it had drained at that first dinner, because she knew. She'd known for weeks. She'd known for 48 years. I said his name is Michael. He was born in September of 1977. He was given up for adoption as a baby, and he spent 2 years just trying to find out who his mother was. I kept my voice as soft as I could. Vivian, the summer you went away to Vermont, the year you came back so thin and quiet that your own family wondered, that was 1977, wasn't it? The silence in that room. I want you to feel it the way we felt it. 12 people, not moving. Aunt Joan's hand pressed to her mouth, Daniel's eyes filling. And Vivian, the woman who always had a polished answer, sitting there with her lips parted and nothing coming out. Finally, she whispered, how dare you? But it had no power in it. It was the sound of a story collapsing. And then I did the thing she'd never have done. I didn't go in for the kill. I walked to the den. And I opened the door. And I brought Michael Doyle into that dining room. He stood there, this big, gentle man in his good shirt, terrified, holding a single old photograph his adoptive mother had kept, the only thing that came with him when he was handed over as a baby. A faded photo of a young woman holding a newborn, just for a moment before she let him go. A 19-year-old girl with dark hair and red highlights catching the light. A girl with Vivian's exact face. He looked at the woman at the head of the table. And he didn't accuse her of anything. He just said, in a voice that shook, hello, I think you might be my mom. I'm not here to take anything from you. I just always wanted to know your name. Vivian Whitfield, keeper of the family standard, queen of the garden club, the woman who tried to test my daughter out of existence, put her face in her hands and broke. 48 years of a buried secret came up all at once, in front of everyone, and there was nothing left to hide behind. For a long moment, nobody moved. You could hear the grandfather clock in the hall. You could hear Vivian crying, not the delicate, controlled sound you'd expect from her, but something raw, something that had been pressed down for half a century and was finally getting out. The relatives sat frozen. Aunt Joan was the first to move. She got up, walked the length of the table, and put her hand on Michael's arm, this nephew she'd just met, and said softly, oh, honey, you have her eyes. And Michael, this big man, made a sound I'll never forget. Half a laugh and half a sob, like somebody had finally answered a question he'd been asking into the dark his whole life. I looked at Daniel. He was staring at his mother like he'd never seen her before. And in a way, he hadn't. The woman he'd been afraid of his entire life was just an old woman weeping into her hands over a child she'd lost when she was barely more than a child herself. The fear he'd carried for 36 years didn't survive that sight. I watched it leave him. Vivian finally lifted her head. She looked around the table at all those faces, searching, I think, for the deference she'd always commanded there, and she didn't find it. What she found was pity and shock, and in a few faces, a quiet kind of disgust, not at the scared girl from 1977, but at the woman who'd spent the decades since making everyone else feel small to keep herself safe. She looked at me last, and for the first time in 8 years, Vivian Whitfield had absolutely nothing to say to me. The smile was gone. The standard was gone. There was just a woman who had been seen, completely, at last. She had given Michael up at 19, alone and frightened, in a time and a family that gave a girl like her no other choice. I want to be fair about that part. That part was a tragedy that was done to her, not by her. But what she did with it afterward, that was the real story. She'd spent her whole life so afraid of being seen as the girl who gave away a baby that she became the woman who polices everyone else's worthiness. She built a fortress of judgment to keep anyone from ever looking too closely at her. And she aimed that judgment hardest at the people who reminded her of her own buried shame, the outsiders, the ones who didn't quite belong. People like me, people like my red-haired daughter, people like the son she'd let go. The red hair, by the way? We found out at that very table. Aunt Joan said it plain. Vivian's own father had been a redhead. The thing Vivian used for 5 years to suggest my daughter didn't belong was, the entire time, the clearest possible proof that she did. Sophie's hair came straight down the Whitfield line through Vivian herself. Let me tell you how it landed, because the consequences were real, even though no judge was involved. Daniel resigned from his mother's shadow that night in every way that mattered. He told her, quietly, that what she did to Sophie to a sleeping child was something he would never be able to unsee, and that until she understood that, he and his family needed distance. He meant it. The man who'd spent 36 years afraid of his mother stopped being afraid in the space of one dinner. The trust unraveled in Vivian's hands too. And fittingly, once the family saw what she'd done, saw that the woman lecturing everyone about lineage and the family standard had hidden a child for half a century, her moral authority was simply gone. You cannot rule a family on the strength of your virtue, once everyone has seen the lie underneath it. The other relatives, including Aunt Joan, pushed for the trust to be handled by a neutral party, a professional, instead of Vivian alone. Within a few months, that's what happened. Sophie's place in it was never in question again, not because I fought for it, because the truth made the fight unnecessary. And Vivian faced the one consequence that actually fit. Not jail, she'd broken no law. The consequence was this. She had to live in a family that finally saw her. The smile didn't work anymore. The standard didn't hold anymore. The power she'd used as a weapon for decades melted, and what was left was an old woman who had thrown away a son and spent a lifetime making everyone else pay for her pain. But here's the part I'm proudest of. The part that's actually mine. Michael stayed. Not in Vivian's life. She was too broken and too proud to let him in. At least at first. And that's her loss to carry. He stayed in ours. Daniel had found a brother he never knew he had. And the two of them, both raised in the long shadow of that woman in such different ways, took to each other immediately. Donna and I became friends. Their kids and Sophie chase each other around the backyard now at holidays. Sophie has cousins. She has an Uncle Michael who builds her the most beautiful little doll houses you've ever seen, by hand. The family Vivian spent her life trying to keep pure got bigger and warmer and more real the moment her version of it fell apart. Last Thanksgiving, my dad and Michael stood in my kitchen arguing happily about the right way to carve a turkey. Two men who'd never have met if a cruel woman hadn't done a cruel thing, and I stood in the doorway and just watched them, and I thought, this is the family she was so afraid of. This noisy, mismatched, fuller than it came table. This is the thing she tried to protect a bloodline from, and it's the best thing any of us has. So, here's what I understand now. That I didn't understand on those dark nights, when I lay awake, doing math, that never came out in my favor. For 8 years, I tried to earn a place in a family that had already decided I didn't get one. I learned the forks. I complimented the hydrangeas. I made myself smaller and smaller, hoping that if I were just acceptable enough, Vivian would finally open the door and let me in. And the truth is, you cannot earn your way in with people who've built their whole identity on keeping you out. They will never hand you the key, because keeping that door shut is the only thing holding them up. The people who guard the gates of family the most fiercely are so often the ones most terrified of their own truth. Vivian wasn't protecting a bloodline. She was protecting a wound. And she'd have let it poison 3 more generations rather than let anyone see it. I stopped auditioning for her love. I stopped waiting to be chosen by someone who was never going to choose me, and the strangest thing happened when I did. I looked up, and I realized I was already standing inside the only family that mattered with Daniel, who finally found his spine, with Sophie, who was never anything but ours, and now with Michael, the brother who got thrown away, the one Vivian called a secret, and I get to call family, because that's the thing nobody at that table understood until it was too late. Family was never the blood you could prove. It was never the name or the trust or the standard. Family is who you refuse to throw away. It's the door you choose to open instead of slam. Vivian spent a lifetime deciding who didn't belong. I'd rather spend mine making room. If this story reminded you of someone, the family member, who made you feel like you had to earn your place, or the one who was quietly cast out, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever stopped trying to win over someone who was never going to let you in? Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.